the Black community paths. So it's a Kujenga Wellness Project acknowledges the lands and peoples of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. We are thankful to be welcomed on this land in friendship. The lands we are situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties and the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the great Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. These lands remain home to a number of indigenous nations and people. We acknowledge this land out of respect for the indigenous nation who have cared for Turtle Island, also called North America, from before the arrival of settlers people until this day. Most importantly, we remember the history of this land has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of friendships with the First Nations who call them home. This history is something we're all affected by, as we're all treaty people in Canada. We all have a shared history to reflect on, and each of us is affected by this history in different ways. Our past defines our present, but if we move forward as friends and allies, then it doesn't have to define our future. Kujenga in Swahili means to build. With Kujenga, we are committed to building an organization that addresses anti-Black racism and the trauma these experiences have had on the Black community. Our Black community has continued to experience repeated trauma and racism. We acknowledge our ancestors who were forced into slavery and to build North America without compensation. We acknowledge our ancestors who fought for freedom, equal rights, and pay, the right to vote, to partake in society, and to feel safe in the home and in the community. We acknowledge that Canada has denied them these rights repeatedly.
Thank you, Raliat, for that. Welcome, everyone. I would like to say thank you for joining us and taking time on your evening today. So you are here at the Kujenga Restoration Co-Parenting Workshop. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of what the purpose of this workshop is. So this workshop is to highlight key issues in co-parenting relationships, from custody and access to the rights and needs of the child, to the socio-emotional impact on children and the parents, to kinship and grandparent care of the child, to fostering parenting and legal guardianship. We do have a panel of professionals that does work in the field in regards to co-parenting. And I'm just going to introduce them to you, and I'll give you a brief synopsis or bio of them. So the first panelist we have, her name is Stephanie Bellan. She's a social worker, co-parenting specialist, and a champion for children experiencing separation based east of Toronto. She runs a private practice for those struggling with their fellow caregivers to find creative ways to work through conflict and make it out on the other side. With over 12 years of experience working with children and their families through trauma, separations, and transition. Ms. Bellan practices from an anti-racist, trauma-focused, and strength-based perspective and brings a wealth of knowledge, empathy, and insight to the table. Our next panelist, her name is Nicole Bedward. She is a registered clinical social work and holds a BA in psychology and a master's degree in social work. Ms. Bedward has been serving children and families for over 20 years and is passionate about fostering change in structures that are embedded in cultural oppression and inequity. Her journey includes working in the mental health sector, child welfare sector, and now the education system. While working in child welfare, Ms. Bedward spent over a decade as an active member of a committee whose mission was to address the unique needs of Black children and youth in care. Most recently, following over 15 years in child welfare, Ms. Bedward made the move to the education system in hopes of addressing the many intersectional ties that negate children and their families from becoming their best selves. Ms. Bedward is also an independent clinician that provides private counseling. She engages in opportunities to foster conversations about inequities that impact racialized populations. It is important to her that she acknowledges the societal barriers and practices that impact the people that she serves. Our next panelist, her name is Andrea Jones. She is the Provincial Manager of Clinical Services at the Office of the Children's Lawyer, otherwise known as the OCL. Ministry of the Attorney General. In this role, Ms. Jones is responsible for overseeing the clinical department's custody access investigations that are conducted by a roster of over 200 mental health professionals throughout Ontario, Canada. In 2018, Ms. Jones's department launched the Voice of the Child reports as part of the services offered to the courts. This service is the largest program of its kind in Canada. Ms. Jones holds a master's degree of social work from McGill University with a minor in psychology. Ms. Jones has nearly 20 years of experience in the social work field pertaining to high conflict custody and access cases, child welfare, mental health, and adoption cases. She works from a collaborative, anti-oppressive, and anti-racist approach. She has presented at multiple training sessions for the OCL in her role. We also have another presenter. Her name is Taya, I believe. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. And sorry, but she'll introduce herself, but I don't have a bio for her. I also want to let you know that we will have a question and answer period at the end of the workshop. However, you can put your questions in the chat box or in the question and answer box, and the presenters will answer the questions accordingly. If you have any questions otherwise, as I stated, please put it in and we'll be glad to answer. So I'm going to start off with Stephanie as she speaks about the co-parenting in a cultural lens and experience for the child. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. My name is Stephanie Bellan, and again, I'm a registered social worker here in the province of Ontario. It is my pleasure to be here to share this time with you and share this information. And my hope is that you are able to take something out of this workshop from all of the wonderful panelists and have a nugget that you can take with you along on your co-parenting journey. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with why talking about co-parenting is so important. So I'm just going to pull up, let me see where my screen share is. This is interesting. I cannot seem to find my presentation, even though it's up. So let's see if I open it there. And if I can't pull it up in the next minute, you're just going to get to hear me talk. There it is. I think I found it. Let's go with that.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, it's there.
And view, present. All right. So this is the inaugural Kujenga Restoration Co-Parenting Workshop. Again, it's my pleasure to be here. Where I wanted to start again is why it's important to talk about co-parenting. And you may or may not have heard reference to the term ACEs or adverse childhood experiences before. I'm not going to go deeply into it, but it is important to have an idea and an understanding of what it is. And essentially what an ACE is, adverse childhood experience, it's a potentially traumatic event that occurs for a child between the ages of 0 and 17 years old. Now, these are categorized in 3 different areas, as you can see here. They could experience some form of abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual. They could experience some form of neglect where their physical needs or emotional needs aren't being met. In this forum, we're actually talking about co-parenting. So if you look in the area of household dysfunction, there is a section where divorce is considered an adverse childhood experience. And divorce isn't necessarily just a separation between a mother and a father, but in the context of our community and what we're doing here, it's essentially a child separation from a loved caregiver. So whether that's an auntie, a grandparent, a cousin, or someone else who's caring for them. So being able to juggle and manage being separated from one of your primary caregivers. And again, why is that important? This study that was done on ACEs, it was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. They had included over 17,000 participants. And what they found is that for people who experienced a higher number of ACEs in their youth, they were more likely to experience some of these issues as an adult, whether it's drug use, alcoholism, cancer, heart disease, depression. So what we have to remember is that these traumatic experiences, these adverse childhood experiences have a very real and tangible impact and result on our kids as they grow into adulthood, which is why it's so important that for us talking about co-parenting, it's so important we're able to find ways to build resiliency in our kids and support them in managing having to go between homes or having to transition between caregivers. Nicole did a lovely presentation a couple of weeks ago. I think it was called Your Child is Not Lazy, and they actually went into a little bit more information around ACEs. So that information is available. If you do want that, please feel free to reach out, and myself or any of the other panelists will be able to send you some information. So cultural implications for co-parenting, right? The co-parenting experience can be really different for BIPOC, and you'll hear me use the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. That's what the acronym stands for. And actually, our other presenters, Nicole and Andrea, will probably go into this a little bit more as well. But for the BIPOC community and people who identify that way, the marriage and divorce rates look different, right? The impact is different. And why is that? It impacts our family constellation. There's a history of systemic racism. When you look at immigration and people who are struggling in poverty, right? This impacts what our families look like. So, gone are the days of the nuclear family where you have a mother, a father, and children in a home. Here, with a lot of these factors in play, we have multi-generational homes, right? Where you've got children, parents, grandparents, where you have extended family members that you're residing with. So when we talk about co-parenting, that shared care of a child can look very different for our communities. And the other piece, which I'm sure will come up later on in the panel as well, is for Black, Indigenous children, they are overrepresented. There is an overrepresentation in the child welfare system. Multiple studies have shown this. This has been the case historically. So having to navigate parenting with a corporate parent, a state parent, like a children's aid society, a child welfare agency, having to work collaboratively with foster parents or with kinship caregivers. This is all part of what co-parenting looks like. So now we can get into the basic elements of co-parenting. The first, I like to call them the 5 C's. So if you have a pen and a paper, it might be helpful to take a couple of notes, jot a few things down. And communication may be very obvious for people, because communication obviously is key when you look at co-parenting, but sometimes we have to take a moment and pause and think about, what does communication look like? So if we think back to our elementary school days, right, we had those 5 W's and the H. So we're going to apply those here. When we're looking at communicating with a co-parent, we're looking at who are we communicating with, right? What information do we need to communicate, or are we looking to communicate? Where are we going to be having this conversation, or where are we going to be sharing this information? When is an appropriate time to communicate, which is a really big deal, because if you need to communicate about a contentious issue or a hot topic, having that conversation when the child is present is probably not the best time to do it, right? Because it's really important. We don't want to be arguing and fighting and exposing children to more conflict. So when we decide to have that communication is really important. Who, what, where, when. Guys, I forgot. Maybe I need to go back to school. Who, what, where, when, why? Why? Why is this message, or why is this information important? And is it necessary? Because sometimes we can also very easily get caught up in an unnecessary back and forth with our caregiver, right? So you really want to think about, what is the purpose of the communication? Why does this need to be shared? Does it need to be shared now? Is there another way that it can be shared, or is it something that could be let go? Because we also have to pick our battles, right? And then it's how, that H. How are you going to share that information? And we can talk about different strategies for communication later on. But that would be the first C. The next C in co-parenting is collaboration. And that is not just collaboration between yourself and the other adult or the other grown-up. That is collaborating with extended family members and friends, reaching out to community services, community resources, getting kids involved in other activities and connecting them with other people in the community. And I know that can be challenging right now in COVID, and we'll be touching on co-parenting and COVID later on in the panel as well. But collaboration is important. You with the other caregiver, but also keeping in mind that, yes, it does take a village. So reach out to people around you if you need that professional support. Thank you for connecting here with Kujenga and participating in this workshop. It's important to use the tools that we have available to be able to help you on this journey. Consistency. Now, we have communication, we have collaboration. It's important to be consistent when you're co-parenting. And when we think about the reasons why there's a separation, why you're in a co-parenting situation, consistency is really helpful in rebuilding that trust with the other caregiver and for your child, right? So when you are showing up consistently, when you are keeping your word and being on time and respecting someone else's time, and when they're able to respect yours, when children are able to predict and understand what is going to happen next in their life, to give them that element of safety and predictability, that is what consistency does, right? So we're able to rebuild some of that trust, maybe mend some broken or hurt parts of the relationship, but consistency, just, you know, if there's a weekly calling every week at the same time, picking up on time, you know, special occasions, if there's a tradition or something that you do with the child every year, right? To be able to maintain some of that consistency is important. This is a tough one, everybody. Compassion. Because as we all know, everyone has their own struggles, right? And maybe right now, this time in your life, co-parenting and having to negotiate with another adult, this may be the hard time right now. But we also need to be able to have compassion for the people that we're working with and for the caregivers we're sharing care with, because again, as I said earlier, it's easy to get caught up in cycles, to get caught up in conflict, or to get caught up in pettiness. And really, we have to take the time to peel back and understand, you know, what is triggering us, what is drawing us into that conflict. But if we can have a little bit of compassion, a little bit of empathy for the other person, then that can often go a long way. So an example can be if someone is coming to meet you for a visit or for an exchange, and they have to take public transit to get to you, and they're 5 or 10 minutes late, we can have some compassion there, right? There's an understanding. We have to look at the situation, look at the context. Now, if they are consistently half an hour, 40 minutes late, then that is an infringement. That can be a boundary that needs to be addressed, right? But it's around looking at the situation and having compassion for the other person, and that can often help moving forward. The last C is celebration. Okay, so when we're co-parents, we want to be able to celebrate as much as we can. We want to be able to celebrate the child, be able to celebrate the child together with the other co-parent as best as you can. We want to be able to celebrate the other caregiver. We want to be able to celebrate that child's other grown-up and be able to say, oh, wow, so Daddy made your favorite dinner the other night? That's fantastic. Oh, it must have been so yummy. or, you know, if they're coming home saying, oh, you know, mommy got my nails painted. Oh my gosh, what a beautiful color. I love the color you chose, right? So to really keep that positivity for the child, because as much as maybe you've had a falling out with that person, that the child's love for that person hasn't gone away and it hasn't changed, right? So maybe your feelings toward them has changed, or maybe you're feeling upset or holding a grudge or a little bit bitter towards them about something that's happened in the past, but that's you and that's not the child, right? So that child still loves them. That person is still important to them. So it's so important to be able to celebrate that other caregiver for your child and to be able to celebrate your child. And I do believe we are going to go into this a little bit more later on, but we can't forget about you, right? You need to celebrate yourself, because co-parenting is hard. It is hard. It is not easy. You miss your child or your children when they're not with you. When you have them, you're exhausted. So you also need to be able to take a step back and celebrate the hard work that you're doing. Okay, so take that time for self-care. And I do believe self-care is an issue we're going to be touching on later on too. So celebration is important. So if you do have a paper, a pencil, you've got your keyboard, hopefully you're on a laptop. This is a workshop, everybody. So don't hate me, but I'm putting you to work. I would like you to take a moment and look at the 5 C's listed there. And I want you to be able to write down for yourself or pop it in the chat if you're comfortable. Which area, which of those 5 C's do you find yourself struggling with the most? Okay. And for you, you can talk, you know, think about an example for yourself. You don't have to share it in the chat, or you can write it down privately on your own piece of paper in the comfort of your own home. Not if you're in your car, because I don't know if you're driving and listening to me talk while you're driving, but please be safe. So write down which of those 5 things you find you struggle with the most. Think about an example of when you've had that struggle and how you responded. Okay. And with the material that I've presented in the first, I don't know how long it's been, 10, 15 minutes or so, try to think about if there's a way you could have responded differently. Do we know if anybody's typed anything in the chat? I don't know how to look at the chat.
Yeah, I don't see anything, but
Okay.
yeah.
That's fine. Okay. So you are not the only one who struggles in co-parenting. Okay. What we're going to go to next is we're going to just identify what some of those common struggles are. So a lot of people that I've worked with or that I've spoken with, there's a struggle around communication and how consistent they are getting it. Sometimes people are popping in and popping out, not talking about what's happening in the home, not sharing issues around the children. There's a lack of cooperation. One-sided parenting, where one parent is doing the majority of the care and feeling like the other caregiver isn't really stepping in. Sometimes there isn't a parenting agreement, or people are not following an agreement as agreed upon, and that's a challenge. And there are safety issues, which I also believe we're going to get to later on in the panel. But safety issues, maybe the other caregiver struggles with mental health issues or with addictions issues, and there's a personal struggle because you're concerned about the safety of the child, which is a whole other discussion, but that is another struggle that people have. And often there are a lot of people who struggle because they don't have a process for how to resolve conflict. But when we are able to find ways to co-parent in a positive and healthy way, amazing things can happen. So kids can be kids. Okay, we're not asking them to pass messages between us. They're not our messengers. We're not asking them, don't tell so-and-so about what we did. We're not having them keep secrets. When we're frustrated, we're not airing our frustrations to the children or in front of the children. And when we don't do that, when we're able to co-parent effectively and efficiently, kids can just focus on being kids, right? And that's what we want for them. They can have positive, meaningful relationships with the adults in their lives. So what's important about this too is to remember that the relationships that they have with other adults, it's not measured by the amount of time spent with them, right? We're looking at the quality of the time that they're able to spend with their caregivers. So for some, there are some arrangements where, a caregiver only sees a child every other weekend, where one caregiver has care of them most of the time, right? But that doesn't undermine the relationship they have based on the time they share. And when we are co-parenting efficiently, we're building that foundation of resiliency for children. So they can learn that they can overcome struggle because they see us do it. They can develop the ability to adapt and to adjust to different situations. And there are more, right? We're looking at social competence. When we're able to model for our children what a healthy relationship looks like, what a respectful relationship looks like, that is helpful to them. And it's important to remember here too, that children don't necessarily do what you say or what you tell them, they do what you do, right? So when children do what you do, we look at how are you interacting with their other caregiver? How are you two able to talk about differences or struggles? Oops, I went backwards. And when we're able to demonstrate that and model that, then that is what children will learn, right? They have better outcomes than for children who are exposed to conflict in the home. They're able to focus on school. They're able to not worry about one parent or another, right? So there are a lot of benefits to co-parenting, and there are a lot of reasons why it's important to put that effort towards working together with them. And to kind of wrap up this little introduction, again, I think it's important to be able to think about what you're grateful for, right? Because when we are struggling or when we're having issues with our co-parent, it's very easy, again, to get lost in the negativity. So think about things that you're grateful for. And sometimes if you're not in the best space, it's really hard to think of something, but there are so many different reasons why you could be grateful towards them. Maybe you have a positive memory, or maybe they did something, they did an arts and crafts with the child, or maybe they picked up a child from a program when you couldn't make it and you gave them a call, hey, I can't make it, can you pick them up for me? So there are so many different little things that we can be thankful for. And if we're able to kind of remind ourselves of those things, it helps shift that framework. And then I give you a mini challenge. Tell them, right? Because sometimes we can think about it. Sometimes we can appreciate something that was done, but sometimes we forget to share it. So I would encourage you to think about a couple of things that you're grateful to your co-parent for, and then take the time to tell them and see how that goes. And that wraps up my mini introduction for co-parenting. And I will open it up. I'm not sure if we're going to do a few questions now, or we can go to Nicole and look for questions later on. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we're going to just go straight to Nicole, and we'll leave the questions at the end for to be answered. Okay, Nicole.
Good evening, everybody. I am honored to be here this evening for this very important discussion. Stephanie, thank you. That was incredible. I really like how you gave some really good tips on, how to successfully co-parent. Unfortunately, my conversation with this group looks a little bit different in terms of some of the struggles we face or children face, families face, when we aren't able to successfully co-parent. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hopefully, with ease, share my screen. And let's see if this is going to work out. Hold on. Okay, I'm thinking it's working. Unfortunately, I don't see anybody once I start sharing.
I don't see anything
We
right
don't
now.
see anything yet, Nicole.
No. Okay, hold on. Let me try to unshare and start again. Let's see. Share.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Awesome.
Started.
Okay.
Yes, you're here.
All right. I'm catching up with my technical skills here. Okay. So tonight, the focus of what I would like to chat about is, and now there we go. Co-parenting in the context primarily of CAS education and some of the poorer outcomes for children who may be subject to some of the high conflict separations. Stephanie's already kind of touched on this, that what I'm specifically talking about is 2 or more people who have actively, and you notice that I've highlighted actively, decided to share responsibility for the welfare of the child or the children. And I specify actively because co-parenting in itself is an active task. It is one that takes commitment and consideration, and is something that should be done and is in fact done actively. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to point out in terms of the role of the parents is sometimes what we often see is that there's now confusion, right? So where there was initially a 2-parent home, let's say mom and dad, parents, whatever that might look like, living together, now separated and living outside the home. And oftentimes we're seeing that there's now confusion, the confusion around the expectation of who is now responsible, what does that look like? And without good communication, that often leads to lots of misunderstanding and sometimes the conflict. So as I mentioned before, it does involve parenting while the caregivers, the parents, are not living in the same home. And I also want to just specify that when we speak of co-parenting, we are, there's a difference between parallel parenting and co-parenting, because we understand that in parallel parenting, each home might have its own different rules and expectations. But when you're co-parenting, it's more of an effort of working together versus 2 independent homes with different structure, different rules, that type of idea. So I love this phrase or the statement, love your children more than you love your ex. I'm purposely leaving a bit of silence here for us to kind of sit with that thought, because I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase before, and it looks beautiful on paper and it's easier said than done. But I think that it is very important when we are dealing with co-parenting situations. Stephanie's already spoken a little bit with respect to what essentially oftentimes is loosely coined parental alienation. However, we do need to recognize that the term parental alienation is not one to be thrown around lightly, that there had been consideration that this parental alienation disorder or syndrome was to be added to the DSM because of the concerns of the outcome, the psychological outcome and impact on the children. But what I'm referring to here is the negative talk about, say, the other parent, the psychological manipulation from one parent to the other, directly to the child. The types of messages essentially that a child would see or hear in that kind of circumstance is that the other parent is dangerous, or that they're not interested in being a part of your life or unavailable. They may hear messages that are reflective of, I'm the only one that loves you. Or messages like, you need me in order to feel good about yourself. Or if you were to pursue a relationship with that other parent, that would jeopardize your relationship with me. So whether or not these messages are intended, directly made, overt or covert, it's the impact that the child has based on some of those interactions with the parent that actually causes them to have, feelings of contempt, hatred, rejection toward the other parent. Okay, so that's just something to be mindful of. And I know that Stephanie did speak to that already. And it is very important because the children are listening. They are privy to even conversations that you may be having with other adults in your life when you feel that no one's listening and that it's safe to do so. When we talk about co-parenting within the Black community, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on stats. I really just wanted an opportunity to speak to you from the heart and from experience, but it is important to put out some of the statistics. As you can see, in an older report, 2004, we saw that 46% of Black children lived in single parent households. Okay. And that is a Canadian statistic. In the US in 2009, they saw that 67% of youth, Black youth specifically, were living in single parent household ran by moms. Okay. So we got to think about the fact that it's a partnership. And like I said, an active partnership that needs to happen. I think that it's also important to note, I don't know if there are fathers in this group, mothers in this group, but if they're in a situation where it's a single mother household and there is a father who's ready and willing to be active, Stephanie's 5 C's, I think it was 5 C's, are very effective in opening that communication and letting that other parent in, be it a father, mother, whatever that may look like. Because again, we can see through statistics that a majority of our Black families at times, I think 46% might have shifted, but a good amount of our Black families or children are living in single parent households. Okay. So I'm not going to be redundant here because Stephanie did speak a lot to some of the implications, the emotional impact on children. A couple that actually really kind of stood out for me are the first two, because we see that these first two items are linked to children and youth learning maladaptive models of problem solving and conflict resolution. So again, it's point 2 just around depression. That's not in order to isolate or to put responsibility on someone who is suffering from mental health. Rather, it is to highlight that oftentimes after separation, there might be anxiety, there might be depression, there are some typical signs and symptoms of that. And where situations arise where conflict is present, you may be seeing a little bit more of the correlates of things like anxiety or depression. And ultimately, this intensifies the stress that the children are experiencing. And an important note, I remember one family that I worked with for what felt like a very long time. There was a separation. Dad was able to move on, find a new partner, and was happy in his life. Mom wasn't. Mom really struggled with the end of that relationship and, wanted hoped that the family could be reunited. And the children saw that. The children saw that she kind of reverted into herself. She wasn't able to, maintain lasting friendships or, start, perhaps dating again. And they worried about her. They worried about her being lonely and not having, an outlet or other people around. And that was a big part of their reaction or response to dad, because they felt they didn't want to leave mom's side. So that ultimately impacted access visits, okay, because they're seeing and worrying. I think it's important to note and for us to remember that Black children who have a relationship with their father fare better academically, have less high risk behaviors, and ultimately, as we know, our jails and prison systems are overpopulated with Black bodies. So I think that's very important for us to keep in mind. And we will talk a bit about the education and the risks there as well. If I'm talking too fast, someone slow me down. I tend to sometimes speak a little too quickly. So next, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about CAS involvement. And again, you'll see that throughout, reminding us all on this call that we need to love our children more than we hate our ex. And I don't know if you've heard that before, but again, I just really wanted to resonate during this conversation. Stephanie has already indicated that Black families and children in care are overrepresented in CAS. And that's by contact. So that's calls to our intake, as well as, open files with families, in addition to children being in care. So I guess this part of the discussion, the important thing to talk about is, if there are safety concerns or risks, if you are worried that a parent is neglectful, essentially harming the child or putting the child at imminent risk, then I'm going to say that everything I say from here out does not apply. Okay, so safety is paramount. However, with that said, there are also other community agencies, kind of like the one that's put on the presentation tonight, to help support families. Okay, so if you were yourself to call CAS, let's talk about that for a moment, because oftentimes we do have parents call themselves during custody access disputes, post-separation. And oftentimes those calls are expressing concern about the other parent and therefore identifying risk or worry. I'd like you to ask yourself the first question being, is there a legitimate risk? Or am I in a place right now where I'm resentful, I'm angry, I'm hurt after, whatever the relationship may have looked like, and that shift yet has just happened and you haven't yet adjusted? Are there other support systems that, I could also reach out to? And again, remember, everything that I'm saying from this point forward is not necessarily a recommendation, suggestion, or discussion around when there are imminent risks to the children or child. You might want to ask yourself, or I used to often ask, families that I worked with, tell me about a time where there was an exception to the rule, right? Where you thought your ex was being a good mother, a good father. What did that look like? What is different now versus then? What resources or what support do you and or your ex need to get to a place once again where you may have thought that they were, an appropriate parent? Also think about too, what is your desired or your hope for desired outcome when calling CAS? Because oftentimes we know that our systems are embedded in systemic oppression. So be mindful of what your hope is when you make that call. Okay. Next slide. So let's say that, a call has now been made to CS, whether it's by you, the school, community person, your ex, whomever that might be, that might look like. And now we're involved. So CS, and by we, CAS. CS gets involved on different levels. Initially, CS, I think, does do their best in trying to engage in the most least intrusive way. So that would become a voluntary service, basically, negotiating what the family's needs are and becoming involved involuntarily. When there may be problems that exist and the family may not feel that there is a role for CS, however CS feels that there's enough concern, then we can, and by we, CAS can become involved legally through a supervision order. And then, of course, worst case, most intrusive scenario is if there are imminent risk concerns, protection concerns, there is the possibility that a child or the children are removed from a home. Okay. So again, with the purview of, we're talking about situations where there aren't direct imminent protection concerns. We're talking about a scenario where there's services, their extended family, there's supports that are available to work with the family through a rough transitionary point. Engaging CAS because of custody access with none of the direct imminent concerns, you got to stop and think about, do you want a perfect stranger, being lawyers and or judges, making decisions for your child or children in their future? Again, remembering that if court doesn't go as planned, what are some of the implications for your child or children? So thinking about what are those alternatives? Again, that could be engaging community supports or services, that could be engaging family, that could be exploring kin or kith. And these are extended family members, or, Auntie Sarah, who is, longtime friend and more family than your own, sibling kind of idea. There are options outside of foster care. And I'm going to bring you back to, Stephanie said it first, and I'm going to say it again, and I've said it already, Black children are overrepresented in care. So during my bio, you heard that I spent over a decade on a committee that the focus really was around identifying first through a needs assessment and addressing the unique needs of the children. So what that looked like was a lot of work with young people in care around understanding what they identified as their needs, a lot of work with foster parents, a lot of work within the system at CAS to help the people that are responsible for their care to understand what the children and youth express to us as their needs. Okay. So a couple of the things that came out consistently right from the get-go during the needs assessment and the probably about 12 years that I was a part of this committee and initiative, the youth spoke very avidly about a loss of culture. They identified a lot of times that they were placed in remote areas or rural areas where they didn't have anyone that looked like them, that they felt they can relate to. They lost things like cultural foods. They lost a sense of connection to their community. And what is even more devastating, as far as I'm concerned, is that loss of identity, right? We also have to consider that oftentimes when children are in care, and if they end up in care for a longer period of time, what happens when they age out? Where are their family members then? Who do they identify with if there wasn't, family connections happening, strong family connections happening while they were in care? We also know that children, and it's been everywhere. We've been hearing about it. OVOV, One Voice, One Vision, has done tons of work addressing this very issue around the poor outcomes for children and youth, Black children and youth coming out of care. And that involves poorer outcomes in the education system, in SES status, social economic status, and poverty, stability, mental health, social relationships, building those trusting, lasting relationships. So we know that there is potentially a very negative impact for Black kids who do enter into care. And now to speak a little bit about Black children and the education system. And before I even go into that, I want to ask you, when you had your child or children, what were some of your hopes for that child? I believe most of us do hope that our children amount to be more than we have been, that they're more successful than we have been, that they're able to, enjoy life to the fullest and reach their full potential, right? And I want to start this slide with that in our minds, okay? And here we can see that the first point speaks to Black children, and this is speaking to specifically the Durham Catholic District Board research that was done. So basically what happened in 2017, Cole's Notes version, I don't want to bore you with a bunch of stats, but what happened in 2017, our education system really was finally able to, after much talks in past, but finally able to kind of reconcile the fact that Black children and youth students were not set up for success in our education system, right? So there was a call for aggregated data. There was a call for changes to be made in the curriculum. Most of you know that there was the call to eliminate streaming. All these things started happening over, a 3-year journey, and recommendations made as a result. So basically what I'm speaking to in this slide speaks to some of that. So we know that Black students themselves were reporting higher incidences of racial profiling. They were 7.7 times more likely than white students to be disciplined. So I'm going to break that down for you in numbers. So that means that out of 127.6 white students that were disciplined for fighting, one out of 127.6 white students would have been disciplined for fighting or bullying, where 1 in 16.5 Black children would be disciplined. And that would look like suspension or expulsion. So we saw higher rates of suspension and expulsion. We know that Black students have experienced 42%. So 42% of Black students have said that they've been, or not have said, have actually been suspended at least one time in their school academia, whereas 18% of white students and 15% of other racialized populations. Okay, so these are really concerning numbers, right? So if we know that the education system is not set up, and we're hoping, and being a part of what I'm seeing is steps to transforming. There's a long way still to go. But if this is what we're seeing, we've got to be cognizant on the poorer outcomes that our children may experience as a result of high conflict separations, is really tying that back into there. I've got a bunch of other stats that, again, I probably won't get into. I could recommend, if you are interested in taking a look at this document, it's like 90 pages long. There are tons of recommendations at the end. If you want to get pen and paper or keyboard, the document itself is called Towards Race Equity in Education, the Schooling of Black Children in the Greater Toronto Area. Okay, so this project included studies and participants from York, Durham, Peel, and Scarborough. Okay, so I'm going to cut out some of the points in terms of the stats, but I did feel it was very important to throw some of that out. Higher dropout rates, again, there's stats in there. I'm not going to get into that. Students feeling and demonstrated like through observation, underestimation of the students who occupy Black bodies, their abilities, right? So we saw this initially through streaming. We saw this through the push, a lot of students being pushed into athletics rather than, focusing on academics. What we saw also was the impact on the student, where they felt that the expectations that were on them were so low that they didn't want to participate. They didn't feel the need to perform academically. And again, lower educational outcome. And a big piece also is the struggle to not seeing themselves reflected in curriculum. And that is something that is currently being pushed more of. But also, it's not just being seen, it's being seen, being able to see positive images. And honestly, at home, we have that responsibility as well, right? To be able to show and model, what we hope our children can learn best from us. So this quote came out of that project, and I just wanted to bring that to your attention. So we as a community need to identify different ways of fostering success amongst our children. We need to focus on markers of success and strategies for building wealth and power so that we can control the outcomes. We need to help them to understand the ways in which education can lead to empowerment and to provide them with messages of strength and success. It is important that we change the focus from Black student failure to Black student success and resilience. The language I like to use is Black excellence, right? And I thought that was appropriate to put here because, again, if you go back to the beginning of my slide, we spoke to more positive outcomes for, our children and youth, where parents are able to co-parent, where parents have positive moms, dads in their lives and consistent, right? So we know that starting at home, we can do some of that work to combat the really detrimental impact that unfortunately our education system has had on our kids. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here at all because Stephanie did an excellent job. I can't do any justice to the job that she's done with respect to what next, right? So again, just emphasis on actively deciding to co-parent. So it's not something we kind of just come upon naturally. It is work. It definitely is work. Deciding that you're on the same team, right? Desiring better outcomes for your children, remembering exactly what it is that you wanted what you want for your children. Stephanie touched already on setting clear boundaries, right? Who's picking up from soccer? Who has, child on the weekend, and what time does that access exchange happen, etc. Clearly conceptualize and define those roles. And I didn't do any talking, and I'm not going to do any talking about step parenting, right? But also that sometimes becomes, or new partners becomes, a source of high conflict, right? So that's really, really important to do. And also recognizing those exceptions to the rules. Remembering when there was a time that you felt that person was an excellent parent, an excellent mom or dad, and giving those compliments. Again, Stephanie said all that. My favorite one is being mindful and living in the present, right? So we know that, after a long relationship, perhaps a marriage, multiple children, who knows what that looks like, and now it's dissolved. And now you're adjusting to that life, right? And possibly it resolved on bad terms. Hearts were broken. People were hurt, right? That makes it really difficult to be able to transition from that romantic relationship to now this co-parenting role. So it is important that we do try to live in the present in those moments, and be in the here and now, and just remembering that you're doing this because you love your child or children more than you hate your ex. and Stephanie did an excellent job on communication. Sometimes it might even be easier for shared calendars. I don't recall if Stephanie had mentioned that. If that is something that might be helpful in a circumstance, that's also something to consider, right? So it's right there, it's clear, no questions asked. So I hope that I did some justice to talking about the impact and intersection of CAS and or the education system. And I thank you for allowing me this time, and I look forward to speaking with you more during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for your presentation. I do want to thank Nicole and Stephanie for the first part of our workshop and providing the information that we have heard. And I hope that for those who are attending, I hope that you do get some information from it. We're actually doing pretty good with time, so I figured that I will actually answer some of the questions that did come through for Stephanie and for Nicole at this time. One of the questions that came in was, how do you, and I'm sure it's open to Stephanie or to Nicole. The question is, how do you deal with interference? So I'm going to assume interference between either of the parents.
Well, I mean, I think it's something a lot of people struggle with, right? But interference, we're going to assume it's between two parents. I don't see the question, so to whoever's asking, please feel free to type in the chat again. But I would wonder, yes, what kind of interference is it? Is it, do you have a schedule? Is there already an agreement set, right? So Nicole was just talking about boundaries. Thank you so much, Nicole, for reiterating that. Having a shared calendar, having a set schedule is very helpful. If they're interfering on time that's already scheduled for you, there are a few different ways to do it, right? Because we also don't want to engage in conflict in front of the child, because we don't want to expose them to more fighting or arguing, right? So it may have to be, we may need a third party to assist, so maybe another friend or family member, to be able to address some of these issues together with the other person. Are they interfering? Are they calling you during your time? Are they texting you during your time? If that's the case, easy fix, put your phone in the other room, right? Your time with your child is your time with your child. And if there was an emergency for that person, you would be checking your phone, but there isn't a need to engage. I did see a comment earlier in the chat from Rudo talking about his frustration being, or her frustration being communication and trying to breathe and not respond right away. Right? We can put our phones down and check them periodically, but it doesn't mean we have to answer them or respond to texts. So the interference piece, I think it depends on, is it happening in person? Is there a schedule? There are a few different things to kind of unpack there. Nicole, did you have any other ideas?
No, I think everything you said just is bang on, and it really depends on the situation. I also wondered if the question possibly was around interference, maybe from a new partner. So I don't know if that's something maybe to explore more, if there are a little bit more details during the question and answer.
So Jason, if the question wasn't answered, or if there's more clarification that you can give, then maybe you can let us know, and then we can get them to go a little bit more into details to answer for you, if you like. I also wanted to ask, what are some of the trends that you are seeing with COVID and co-parenting? Once again, this is for, I guess, anybody at this point.
Well, I can start. I can start. It's been a challenge. I've certainly encountered people who have used the pandemic to alienate further the other caregiver, and Nicole touched on how impactful and damaging that can be, and that's definitely been a challenge. I did have a note here. It's on my phone somewhere. I'm not going to look for it, but the pandemic is not cause to withhold access to a caregiver. So as much as there are people who have tried to use it as an excuse, we have to be able to work together to find creative ways around it. I mean, yes, there are going to be situations where maybe a child has to quarantine for a certain amount of time. But there are always creative ways to do it, right? Window visits, driveway visits, coming up with an agreement to make up time. And I mean, this is where that flexibility and that compassion piece as part of those 5 C's is really important, because no one has gone through a pandemic before, but that's something that we've all got to be able to figure out together. Phone calls, video chats. It also plays differently for people that live a larger distance away from one another. So that can further complicate issues, but that's kind of what I've been seeing more of. There just really has to be more flexibility and more willingness to work around it. And often you may need help from a third party, a friend, a family member, a professional, to be able to navigate some of that.
Nicole, did you want to add something?
Yes. So I just left CAS in September. So of course I'm speaking to pre the return of school, pre September, but I was even noticing that files that I had closed previously, custody access files that I'd closed previously, were now coming back, and the calls were coming in fast and furious about, someone not letting the other see the child or children due to COVID. Calls relating to, I just heard my partner was at the mall with the children during their access time. So yeah, the impact of COVID definitely was being seen at CS as well.
Is any of the other panelists would like to speak on this question?
Hi, it's Andrea. So I actually am going to be speaking a little bit about that in my presentation in terms of what we're seeing at the Office of the Children's Lawyer. But I could tell you within 3 days of the lockdown, we started to see emergency motions coming in terms of COVID being part of the custody dispute. So it was almost instantaneous.
Okay, thank you. And this also will go for you too, Andrea, but what is the difference with the OCL role when working with the CAS and when working with the family? I'm not sure if that's part of your presentation or if you want to speak to that now.
I could speak to that now. So the OCL, we have different functions. So we do custody access disputes. We also do child protection representation. So that is more on the legal side. We can have clinicians assist on those legal child protection cases. So basically those lawyers are representing the views and preferences of the child in a CAS matter. And if there are many clinical issues at play, then we would provide a clinical assist to that. And then the other side of it is our custody access investigations. So our Section 112 reports that do full investigations on custody disputes. So that's the difference between CAS and OCL. And we are specifically, my department, the clinical department, we are strictly focused on custody disputes. And as soon as risk, neglect, abuse, any kind of those things come into play while we're investigating, we'll actually go on hold and pause and let the CAS process go forward. And then once that's resolved, then we'll come back in. So it's 2 really separate entities.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. So what I think we'll do is we'll go on to the next panelist. I'm going to introduce her, as I wasn't able to give her a proper introduction in the beginning. And I hope I say your name correctly. So please correct me if I do not. So before you, we are going to have Taye Adeni. She's going to be joining us right now. She is also a child protection worker with the Catholic Children's Aid Society of Hamilton. She has her own clinical practice that is located in Hamilton. Mrs. Adeni works with children and families who are struggling with the impact of post-separation conflict and who are looking for skills and tools to co-parent effectively. She utilizes a trauma-informed, strength-based approach to work with families who are struggling with various challenges within the CAS and private practice. She does have an understanding of how adverse childhood experiences impact development, and her goal is to empower clients to work through individual and family challenges. So please welcome Mrs. Adenye, and she will be speaking next. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're
I
welcome.
will share my screen here. Let's see if we can do this. All right, I think you guys can see it. Great. Oh, sorry, I should have done this first. Okay, so as Anada mentioned, my name is Taye, and I am a registered social worker. I work with the Catholic Children's Aid Society, and I have to say that I'm acknowledging my own bias when it comes to talking about co-parenting. My experience in working at CAS has really helped me to see that it's the impact on children's mental health is something that's important that we talk about, and that I often wonder if parents recognize just how much the importance of co-parenting can really help their children and their outcome. And not to share too much like personal information, but I had worked with a family and I engaged with them. They had been involved for previous years. We would get allegations from the mother and the father. And over time, I started to see, I received the file, and within the first month, I started to see the impact of the arguing on the child. The child had been diagnosed with some depression, and the father had alleged that it was the mother who was causing the depression. And from talking to the child, I really started to understand that it was really having to play the role of being the in-between, the go-to, watching his parents argue. That was really what was impacting his mental health. And unfortunately, it wasn't until he was hospitalized that the parents really realized and acknowledged what their role was. And that was because they actually had to come together to fight the medical system. So they used the conflict and they found the common enemy, and they were able to work together. And since then, we use that as an opportunity to really teach them about co-parenting, about working together collaboratively. And what was so amazing is that within 3 months, his mental health had improved significantly. So just from that experience, I felt so strongly. I saw firsthand just how much co-parenting can impact children's mental health. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of separation and divorce on children. As Stephanie and Nicole have mentioned, when we talk about co-parenting, it's not just in the context of parents who have been separated or divorced. So hopefully, as I'm talking, I know, again, because of my bias and my experience and just how I work in this area, I will refer a lot to parents, and like mothers and fathers, but I acknowledge that co-parenting can take the forms of, grandparents, aunts and uncles as well. So for children, what research has shown is that mostly it's not the actual divorce itself or the separation that impacts the child's mental health. It's actually the conflict and the ongoing, so the conflict that initiated the divorce and also the ongoing conflict after the divorce. That's really what causes the child to feel the most distress. And with the anger and the arguing and the chaos that's involved in the separation, it really impacts how the child's emotional and psychological well-being. Of course, children love both their parents, right? So when their parents are fighting, they often feel that pressure of choose sides, who's right and who's wrong. When they hear their parents bad-mouthing the other one, it puts them in a very, very difficult situation. And again, it almost changes if you think about it, divorce almost changes the individual's perspective in life. They grow up and and again, I do acknowledge that this isn't always the case for many people, but they grow up in an environment where their parents are cohabiting, and then all of a sudden they're told or they're provided information that what they knew is no longer what will be. So they have to kind of wrap their heads around that change and the transition. And when done, already there's going to be a disruption in their routine, in their life. But if it's done in the context of conflict and arguing and bantering, it makes the process of the transition that much more difficult. Now, what would impact the conflict with the parent would be the impact on them, right? So, and I'm looking at this from, I know there's impact in terms of financial impact, like relocation, but I really want to focus on really the mental health and the emotional and psychological impact on parents in the process of the separation and divorce. So as you know, there would be hate, possibly like anger, hatred, hurt, disappointment, guilt, probably an element of shame, anxiety, frustration, mistrust. And even in some cases, as I believe it was Stephanie that mentioned earlier, an increase in depression as well. And these emotions will impact how they view the situation, how they view the partner, and also their process in the separation and moving forward as well. And I really just want to highlight anger because oftentimes I think of anger as a secondary emotion. So anger is usually the one that we feel that we can use to mobilize us, to get us into action. And in the context of separation or divorce, or anger becomes that fuel that actually increases the conflict, right? And anger will impact the parenting, it will impact the own parents' mental health and also their physical health as well. And then if we look underneath the anger, there's likely the other emotions that I explained earlier. So there's likely, that's where the pain or the disappointment or the guilt or the shame comes in. And I think for parents, it's so important that they kind of search within themselves and recognize or acknowledge, what are they feeling? How has the separation or the change or the divorce, how has that impacted them? Hopefully taking away that layer of anger and really exploring what else could be underneath there. So just some risk factors that might impact children's, like the impact that might affect the impact of, divorce and separation on children's mental health is lower income, again, parental conflict or domestic violence. If there is a diminished capacity to parent or what we would call poor parenting, if there's a limited contact with one parent, and also parental alienation, which Nicole did touch on earlier. If there's a lack of monitoring of children's activities, if there's multiple family transitions, if there's parental mental health problems that have not been resolved or that's not being cared for, if there is chaotic or unstable relationships, and impaired parent-child relationships. So some protective factors that might increase the overall well-being of children in the process of separation and divorce or afterwards as well is resilience. If they have other supportive relationships, such as like siblings, so they're not going through it alone, there's extended family that's really gathering around them, and community members, so community services such as the one here, or other community groups that they can go to so that they feel that they're not alone in the process. If they're taught some problem solving skills, some self-regulation skills, and also some self-efficacy. The parent's psychological well-being will really act as a protective factor, economic stability. If they believe that life has meaning and that there's even hope at the even in the midst of the separation or even after the separation and divorce, if there's effective caregiving, optimism, co-parenting, healthy relationships between child and parents, and if there's stability in the household, and a child-centered approach to separation. And that's where I want to kind of touch on next. So a child-centered approach to separation and divorce is when the parents engage to doing what is truly best for the children, despite the anger and the emotions that they might feel towards each other. So just some questions here that they can ask to help maintain the child-centered approach is what's best for our children today, tomorrow, and the years to come? How can we minimize the physical, emotional, and spiritual damage inflicted upon our children from our pending or divorce or from the separation? How can we best support our children through this difficult time? How can we show the child love, compassion as they move through the challenges? What can they do to boost their sense of security, self-esteem, and well-being through the transition? Who can provide the least traumatic home environment for the child? How can each of the parents contribute their assets, whether it's physical, emotional, and spiritual, to create a healthy environment that will increase peace in the home? How will the child look back at the divorce 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and will they understand? And how can they make life better for the children after the divorce? So 5 tips for a child-centered approach is keep it factual. Again, talking earlier, there's going to be a lot of feelings that arise in the as you're dealing with the other parent, likely anger, frustration, disappointment, hurt, pain. So when the feelings come in, they cloud the plan or the process of moving forward. So keep it factual. Don't make it about yourself. Focus on the child and ensuring your goal is what's best for the child. Ask yourself, how will the decision affect your child now or in the future? Don't argue over the small detail of the parenting plan, and also get a third party to help you. A mediator, someone for direction, sometimes just having an outsider to help, to share information, to offer a different perspective is really helpful. And put yourself in the child's shoes and try to see from their perspective as well. So Nicole did touch on this, so I'm not going to really go into detail in terms of the role of the Children's Aid Society. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. So Children's Aid can get involved for, I guess I'll say possibly, I'll focus on 1 of 3 reasons. One is if a community, so such as the police or the teacher or counselor calls and addresses conflict that's going on in the home. Another is if the police or a caregiver or one of the parents or community service provider contacts the CAS and reports an abuse in the context of a separation or divorce. And the other one is when there's post-separation conflict as well. So if again, the community or the parents themselves are calling, and typically we would code it, and I'm going to focus particularly on the impact of the conflict on the children. So we would typically code post-separation conflict. And the reason why I want to talk about that in particular in terms of CAS's approach is because that's where, again, I see the emotional harm. And just looking at mental health, we would be looking at what is the emotional impact of the conflict on the child. Emotional harm is one of the most difficult things to verify. So when I think of my work with the families and the role of custody and access, I usually like to work with them in terms of if it isn't the emotional harm on the child, how can we support you to better understand how your actions are impacting your child right now? Because again, when there's emotions, when there's anger, it's just so difficult for the parents to see what role they're playing. And as I mentioned earlier, there can be very lasting consequences, and not just the ones that are visible in terms of suicidal ideation, but oftentimes it shows up as behavioral as well. So I like to think of my role, we've heard from Andrea's presentation earlier that the CAS can often be a very intrusive manner in terms of working with families. I work for the CAS, so I often like to think that I don't want my role to be intrusive. I want to see how I can help the families even in the context of this service, right? So my goal is always to try to get the families to see their actions, how it's impacting the families, what they're doing. And unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't get to that point where they're able to recognize it, and we may have to take more intrusive measures. But I usually will like to try to connect them with community services that will provide them a better understanding. So I'm often conflicted because I see the negative impact the CAS has, especially on the Black community. As we've heard, they're overrepresented in the child welfare system. But sometimes I wonder, is there a role that I can play? I'm in the system, I'm within the system. Is there a role that I can play supporting the family so it doesn't lead to them going to kids going into foster care, going into extended society care? So that's how I always try to approach my work with families. Can I increase their awareness, their understanding of how their actions are impacting their children, and can I work with them and gather community services around them so that the issues can be addressed or can be resolved. Of course, I do find that there's limitations in terms of working with the CAS. One is that we don't have a great understanding. There hasn't been enough research or data that's been collected around custody and access. We don't have a really great understanding in terms of how many cases are we getting where the parents are calling, where the community services are calling. And I think doing some research on that, understanding that would be really important. I do have to say that just in talking to my colleagues, I do know that oftentimes custody and access cases are one of the most difficult to manage, because our goal is to keep children safe and to protect them. But also we need to verify the allegations, right? So we're trying to distinguish, is the allegation verifiable or is it not? And then of course, if the case is involved in family court, that offers an additional complexity, because the moment we're involved, that's put on hold. So there's just so many complexities involved. And we work really hard to navigate through that. And oftentimes we get phone calls from father, mother reporting things, and all the while we're seeing the impact on the children. And I think what's distressing the most is that they're so caught up in what's going on and what the parent's doing or not doing that they don't see how it's impacting the well-being of their kids. So in terms of possibilities, I often like to dream of what could the CAS be? We know what we've been in the past, we know where we currently are, but what could our future be? And I wonder if CAS could be a place, an establishment that really fosters co-parenting and that really supports families as they're as they're acknowledging the challenges, that the very real challenges that come with co-parenting. And I wonder if we can somehow play a role in supporting families to navigate through that in a way that's not necessarily hostile, but that helps them be collaborative and move forward. And I know that I tend to be an optimistic thinker, but I just sometimes, I ask myself, if I'm going to be in this system, I want to make sure that my work, or the work that could possibly be done in this system, could somehow make a difference in a beneficial way for the children that we work with. We already have interactions with these families. We're already working with families and with children who are dealing with high conflict. Can we somehow work with the families? Can we work with the children? Can we connect them to the right services in the communities to help them? So the role of community, as I mentioned, part of what CAS would do is we would connect the families, the parents, to community service providers such as mediators, therapists, counselors, life coaches, and clergy, and also, of course, community service providers such as this one. And the goal would be that they help them identify risk factors, strengthen protective factors, enhance the children's capacity to cope with family changes, and of course, educate, right? So helping families understand by hosting panels like this one in terms of what are the challenges with co-parenting, what could be the benefits of co-parenting, and also helping them build those skills in terms of how to co-parent moving forward. So just the role of parents and caregivers can be to shift their role, right? So they're no longer just the formal spouse, former partners, they're now co-parents. So their goal is always to maintain that child-centered approach. their role together. They're always going to be the father, always going to be the mother, always going to be the aunt, the grandparent of that child, right? So even though there's a changing role in their interactions together, their role in terms of the child is always going to remain the same. And I think if they take that approach, always going to be the same role for the parent, for the child, they'll be able to move forward. Understanding the impact of parental conflict. So again, unfortunately for my example that I shared earlier, it took a really harsh wake-up call for the family to understand the impact of the parental conflict. So the more parents are educating themselves now, the more they're developing a greater understanding of how parental conflict impacts the child's development, the more they'll be motivated to engage in co-parenting or learn better ways to co-parent. And the D is develop an understanding and skills around anger management, communication, and conflict resolution skills. I think that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was great information. Once again, this is such a great workshop. We're getting a lot of wealth of knowledge from all of our panelists. So next we will have Andrea, who will speak to us about the legal side of co-parenting. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm Andrea Jones, and I'm the Provincial Manager for Clinical Services at the Office of the Children's Lawyer. I'm just going to try to share my screen with you. Just give me a second. Let's see. Presentation. So I think we've all had this issue in terms of trying to get the share going.
Can you find it?
Hold on, I'll just come out of this.
My presentation was online and I actually needed to not open a new tab. I had to open it in a new window for it to show up as an option.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Another option is you can email it to me and I can screen it for you.
And just try one last time. Ah, there we go.
There we go. I can see it.
You guys can see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just switching to the slideshow, if you will. All right, so my presentation is going to be on the Office of the Children's Lawyer, co-parenting, and of course, COVID-19 pandemic and how all of those things are kind of meshing right now. Hold on a sec. Go. Perfect. So just as an overview, the Office of the Children's Lawyer is an independent law office within the Ministry of the Attorney General. So we provide legal and clinical services to children right across the province. We have about 20,000 children who receive services from our office. And our head office is located in Toronto. However, we have clinicians that work for us, clinicians and lawyers that work for us all across the province. So from Cornwall to Thunder Bay, Sarnia, here in the GTA, and the in-house staff, so in-house clinicians and lawyers, they provide supervision to those clinicians and lawyers that are out in the various regions. And so in terms of who the children's lawyer for Ontario is. Marian Jacko is the children's lawyer herself. She's been our children's lawyer for 4 years now, so it'll be 4 years this month. She has a degree in social work, a master's in social work, as well as a law degree. She used to be a lawyer in the office as well for a good 17 years. She then went on to the Indigenous Justice Division, the Mother Risk Commission, and then she came back to the office as our children's lawyer. So within our office, we have Property Rights Department, which takes care of children's civil rights and property rights. We have the Legal Personal Rights Department, so that's where we have custody access, child protection cases. And then we have the Clinical Personal Rights Department, where we focus on custody access cases. So custody and access disputes, the court basically makes a request to our office. So say, for example, we have two parties coming in complaining about, one person is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, the other person is doing something else. The court can't make sense of it in terms of who's saying what, and the court may decide, you know what, I think that the services of the OCL would be needed here. So they would make a request to our office. We would decide whether we would accept the file or not. And if we do accept it, we'll decide whether it'll go to a clinician, who is usually a social worker, a lawyer, or sometimes even a team of both. And we do get referred some of the more difficult custody and access cases. So I'll be giving you a couple of examples in terms of when custody access disputes, high conflict custody access disputes go awry. So in terms of the clinical investigations that we provide, once we decide that we're going to accept the case for an investigation, we review all of the documents that come in, so a lot of the legal documents. We interview the parties, so we meet with the parties, we meet with the children, we conduct observation visits with each party and the child. We speak to collateral sources, so we can speak to schools, CAS, police, if indicated, other therapists, social workers that might be working with the family, medical professionals. We also speak to personal collateral. So if there's a grandma or auntie, uncle that is really part of the child's life and really part of the parenting plan and the family core for that child, then we're definitely going to speak to that person as well. And so once we gather all that information, then we're going to provide some recommendations, and our recommendations are best on the best interest of the child. So it's not what the child says, it's not what one party says versus another party says. It's going to be all of the information that we've gathered throughout the investigation in terms of making a recommendation to the court on what we are seeing in terms of what is best for the child in this custody access dispute. And so our investigations typically last for about 90 days, but sometimes it could go a little bit longer, especially if we're waiting for some of those collateral reports to come in. So clinical considerations. So what are some of the things that our clinicians, when they're doing these investigations, are looking for? And one of the first things that we want clinicians to look at are, what are the strengths? What are the good things? What is happening in the parent-child relationship that's really a positive? And then we start to look at some of the history, so the relationship history, the post-separation history, what are some of the family and community supports that the family has, what kind of therapeutic interventions, if any, exist. We also want to look at the cultural considerations. So, and sometimes what we see in our disputes is that culture can be repressed and oppressed in some of these disputes. We look at what is the current custody access arrangement. So how are exchanges happening? How are decisions made in terms of healthcare, education, extracurricular activities? How is that happening? Is it one party that's doing that? Is it both of them together? Those are the things that we're going to look at historically and presently in terms of the dispute. And we're also going to look at whether there is a presence of intimate partner violence, so domestic violence, alienation, is there substance use and abuse, mental health issues, instability, inconsistency. We heard a little bit about that earlier this evening. Recurring police and child welfare involvement. So are we getting a lot of those calls back and forth between the parties? We're looking at the child's development and if there's any developmental delays. So these are some of all of the things that we are assessing for in a custody and access dispute. And so once we gather all of that information, we then ask the parties to join us in what we call a disclosure meeting, whereby all of the information that we gathered over the course of the investigation is revealed to the parties. And you would think, well, the parties would know all of the information about the other party, they were in a relationship with them, et cetera, but sometimes parties don't necessarily know everything that is going on in the other person's home, which is probably one of the reasons why we're involved. And so this disclosure meeting, it also gives the parties an opportunity to not only hear the recommendations, but potentially settle the custody access dispute right there in that meeting, or walk away from the meeting and will eventually be filing a report, and then they can settle off of the basis of that report. And so once we file that report, then basically our involvement in that custody access dispute is closed. So even though the custody dispute may still go through the courts, our piece is done. We're in, it's a punctual service, we do the assessment, and then we leave. So I wanted to give you an example of an intimate partner violence case that we recently closed. It was a very serious case. We got the referral after the pandemic had started. And so this was a case whereby there was historic and severe intimate partner violence. So father was alleging that mother was mentally ill, that she was making unfounded claims about abuse. Mom, of course, was alleging the abuse. And what the clinician basically uncovered was that there was major features of cultural oppression. So denial of one race over the other race. And that basically, for example, mom in this case was seeking services that were very culturally appropriate and culturally based, and father would not agree to those services proceeding because he didn't feel that that was important. This father was also quite wealthy, is quite wealthy. And so there was a lot of financial oppression going on, and also extreme physical and psychological abuse, stalking, and I would even say that there was torture going on in the house with the children present. So in this particular case, what had happened was the onset of the pandemic was announced. The parents were still living together. However, things were not going well. The abuse was continuing. And so the children who were 9 and 5 at the time were basically put in a separate part of the home. And the father would carry mom into another area of the home and systematically torture her for weeks. Eventually, on one occasion, she was able to escape the home. And this is where he had threatened to kill her, kill the children if she didn't come back into the home. However, she she left, she called the police, and multiple charges were filed. So because of father's finances and resources, he was able to arrange a really liberal access arrangement. And so access continued with the 9 and 5-year-old, despite these very serious criminal charges and CAS involvement. And, and so as a result, the access with the children, that time was spent a lot with, in terms of buying things for the children, you know, doing things that they really liked, when as previously, historically in the relationship, that wasn't the father's interactions with the children. So the children, since the separation, were like, this is fantastic, this is great, and you know, we like this, and even though it was scary with dad and we remember certain incidents and whatnot, things are better now, and so you know, we want to see him. His access was supervised by his parents. And when I say supervised, I say that with air quotes, because we also quickly found out that the access was not supervised by his parents. And so there was a lot of concerns in regards to the custody of these children, the access that the children were having, and of course, very high needs in terms of criminal charges, CAS, and I would even say a high level of dangerosity in regards to mom's safety and the children's safety. And so one of the things that we also see in IPV cases is sometimes the perpetrator uses the court process to continue the abuse and control in the relationship. So parental alienation, we talked a little bit about that earlier this evening, and this is just my definition. It's not an official definition, but just basically it is the systemic manipulation of a child by one parent that results in rejection of the other parent. And the rejection could also be directed to extended family members. So a grandmother, you know, an uncle, etc. The child can exhibit fear, anger, disgust towards the alienated parent. The child may repeat what the dominant parent has to say about the parent. So, you know, my mom is lazy, or whatever the case may be. The child can have frivolous reasons or no reason at all for wanting to stop contact. And the dominant parent may be, as I mentioned in the previous case, the dominant parent may be buying the child's attention and love. So we see a lot in parental alienation cases, we see a lot of new gadgets and maybe a puppy and, you know, those types of things going on in order to kind of curry favor for the child. And I will say this though, with alienation, many do allege that alienation is going on. However, it is a very high bar, a very high clinical bar to pass. The threshold is quite high. So we would have to see all of these features plus some more in order to really say, this is a case of alienation. And even so, we're very careful in pronouncing that. Usually you would have to be considered an expert on the topic in order to actually say that. What we talk about is gatekeeping, you know, undue influence. Those are some of the terms that we would use when we do see some of these behaviors. So another case example that we have in regards to alienation. So this is a case whereby the mother has successfully alienated the child, the oldest child, against the father. And so the eldest child is quite hostile, says that, you know, he doesn't want to see the father, but can't really give concrete reasons. It's very fleeting. The eldest child is also now a co-alienator and trying to influence the younger child. So we do see that sometimes in severe cases of alienation. And so the eldest child, for example, when these kids were having access with their father, that eldest child would be monitoring, reporting back, texting back to mom in terms of what was happening between the youngest child and the father. You know, their interactions, was it lovey-dovey, was it cozy, was the child, you know, upset with father, why was the child upset with father? So, you know, that eldest child was basically a co-alienator in the situation. And unfortunately, in this particular situation, as we were working through the case, we were losing contact with the mother. And it has become so severe that we no longer know where the children are going to school. When we speak to the school, they have no more information as to where the children have moved to. We don't know where the mother is located. The father does receive messages from the mother saying, you know, children are fine, when he says, well, could you tell me where they are? Where are you guys? What's going on? He'll get text messages with laughing emojis and that kind of thing. We definitely saw a history of gatekeeping, lack of information sharing by the mother. And so we're literally in the situation just last week where the father is having to contact the authorities. We're not sure if we're able to proceed on the case because we don't have a mother and children. We don't know where they are right now. So that's a very severe case of alienation. And so our cases can range to something like this, to something that is a little bit softer and just kind of creeping in. So it kind of runs the gamut. So the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I mentioned earlier, almost immediately we started to see COVID-19, you know, entering into the custody access dispute fray. And right now, parents need to make decisions with exposure to the virus in mind, right? So are they going to school? Are they going to do online school? Are they going to do extracurricular activities? Can they visit extended family members? Can they go on trips, especially, you know, in the summer when the cases were lower, the COVID cases were lower. We got a lot of that in terms of whether people could travel outside of the province or to the cottage, that kind of thing. And so these issues now add another layer to the custody and access disputes, right? And children, of course, are greatly impacted by COVID. Many of them were, you know, having to do online school in the spring, and to now have a custody dispute where COVID-19 or other factors are a feature. It's really a powder keg for kids. And so issues of abuse, alienation, high conflict, all of that has intensified over this pandemic. So on March 24th, Justice Pazarat, who is a justice out in the Hamilton area, so with the Superior Court there, he released pretty much a landmark decision in the province and also just for North America. And so you notice the date, March 24th, it's literally, you know, probably a week out after the lockdown here in the province. And so the mother in this file had filed a motion to stop access. Basically saying, I'm social distancing, we're not going outside, and I don't want my child to leave the house in order to have access with the father. And so this case was heard probably a day or two prior to the release of the March 24th decision. And basically what the justice is saying here is that, yes, COVID-19 is definitely impacting all of our lives, you know, putting things on hold. but we can't indefinitely put on hold a child's relationship and access to another parent without causing serious harm and upset to that child. We can't have a blanket policy that says children should never leave their primary residence, not even to visit another parent. It's just not realistic. And as we can see with this pandemic, it's probably going to last for quite some time. So just imagine if we had court decisions talking about children not seeing another parent face-to-face for a long period of time. So it really was an important decision, and a lot of the decisions that have come after this really models this and quotes this in terms of jurisprudence moving forward with access and questions around COVID-19. So what are some of the issues that we're seeing with the pandemic? We do know that prior to the pandemic, some people were having supervised access. So perhaps there was an issue whereby there was instability, inconsistency in terms of access, or some kind of mental health or substance abuse problem. And so that necessitated supervised access. However, during the lockdown, many of the access centers closed. And even after the lockdown, some centers continued to remain closed, but some started to offer in-person access visits, so socially distant supervised access. Some centers offered virtual visits. So those have been occurring. However, as a result, waiting lists for supervised access has dramatically increased. And what we're seeing now is that some parents have not had in-person access with their child for several months. And if they were having supervised access even before the pandemic, they're creeping up on a year almost in terms of no in-person access. So obviously, we're seeing people come to court and asking for our services in terms of, hey, what can be done to stop this not being able to see my child in person. The other thing that we're also seeing is that when there is virtual access, sometimes we are hearing of complaints whereby the primary caregiver, so where the child is primarily living, is facilitating the virtual access, and maybe they're making comments while the child is having a virtual visit with their parent. Maybe the call drops all of a sudden. So again, we're seeing some access interference that is bleeding into the custody dispute because of the pandemic. We're seeing primary caregiver strain. So as Nicole had mentioned earlier, a lot of children in our community are being cared by a primary caregiver. And during the pandemic, if children are going to school online, someone is home with them. And that's usually the primary caregiver. And so sometimes the access parent just may not be available because, they have work obligations and whatnot. So the primary caregivers are saying, well, I need a break, right? I'm here with the child constantly, for school, and then it's the evening, and then it's bedtime, and then we do it all over again. And so the access parent, however, may object to the child spending time with extended family members or a friend or whatnot because they are afraid of COVID-19 exposure. And so that is also adding stress to the co-parenting relationship. So the other thing that we're also seeing is separations and custody disputes due to the pandemic. So the pandemic itself has created separations. So say, for example, the relationship itself was not all that strong to begin with. The pandemic starts, and then the pandemic itself further exacerbates cracks in the relationship. And now all of a sudden you have parents who weren't planning on separating, weren't thinking of separating, but are now at a point where they can't be together anymore, but they still have to live together because of course they weren't planning to separate. And so imagine, you know, as a child being in a home where you know that your parents don't want to be together, but they're physically in the house. It's probably one of the more difficult and extremely sad cases that we have to deal with. The other thing we're also seeing is that successful co-parenting relationships have deteriorated. So things were working great, COVID-19 starts, and then now there's lifestyle concerns, there's differences in COVID-19, and you know, some people think, well, you know, it's not that serious, some people do. And so now the parties are having disagreements as to what should happen with the kids. Should they go to school? Should they go to their friend's house? Should they engage in extracurricular activities? So we're seeing that. One, I guess, some of the silver linings, if you will, that we're seeing out of this pandemic is that all of a sudden, some of these custody disputes have resolved. So the complete opposite of what I was just talking about, and that basically this health crisis has really galvanized people together to work together and make decisions and communicate better around their children. So the custody and access issues are now irrelevant. You know, access has increased, the children are doing well, great communication. And so it's actually quite wonderful when we pick up a file, we contact the parties, and they're like, we don't need you guys because we've figured it all out. It's absolutely fantastic. And we did see an uptake and continue to see an uptake in that during this pandemic. So whether we're in or out of the pandemic, what is the impact of high conflict custody disputes on children? So some of the behaviors that we could see in kids is parent pleasing, right? So trying to say and do things that mom or dad would like. Some of the things we could see as well is behavioral changes in school, inattention, school truancy. We could see aggression in and outside of the home, opposition. We could also see sleep disturbances, regression in development. So say, for example, you have a toddler who is learning how to potty train. You could see, you know, the child falling back on that. Appetite disturbances, so not eating or eating too much. And then with the older kids, you know, we can see things such as drug use and abuse, delinquency, features of anxiety and depression, self-harming behaviors. So, you know, we've heard a lot of some of these cases going to CAS. Sometimes we get the case. Nicole had talked about, you know, having strangers trying to figure out some of these issues for you in terms of, you know, if you're not able to effectively co-parent. These are some of the behaviors that you could see in the kids. And then, of course, you start to have all of these systems now intervening in your family situation, something that you necessarily did not want, weren't expecting, and not fully understanding how far the reach is. And I think that's really important for us in the community in terms of really understanding just how far things can go, and keeping that in mind in terms of the importance of effective co-parenting. So communication is key. We heard about the 5 C's. That was done really expertly by Stephanie. So communication really is the foundation of co-parenting, right? And if you are communicating and it's going difficult, it's not going well, then don't continue communicating in that manner. So if you're talking on the phone and it's resulting in arguments, move it to text. If the text messages are getting out of control, move it to email. And if the emails are not working, that's where you're probably in a high conflict situation. You may need to use a communication app such as Our Family Wizard or Two Homes. Your communication style really has to remain courteous and concise and about the kids. So it's about a goal, a specific appointment, exchange, access, whatever the case may be. And if you don't want to use one of those communication apps, then is there an uncle, an aunt, a friend who is, okay with your ex and is willing to communicate on behalf of you in order to facilitate, vital information flowing between both of the parties. Unfortunately, and some of the cases that we have in severe disputes, the lawyers may have to handle the communication, or you might need a parenting coordinator. And so this is where things start to get expensive. Things start to get, a little bit difficult. But again, communication is key, and you need to find yourself out of poor communication. So in closing, remain child focused, try to find common ground, focus on the strengths of the other partner. A poor couple relationship doesn't mean that the parent is a poor parent, right? So sometimes we get hung up in terms of, I don't like this person, et cetera, but they could be a really good and strong parent. Seek support, go for mediation. Just do not put the kids in the middle. Children do derive their identity from both parents. So do not denigrate, do not have those conversations in front of the kids or when the kids could listen. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for your presentation. So we had a great wealth of knowledge tonight from all four of our panelists, which was really great information, especially when we are in situations where we are co-parenting. I know we've gone over a little bit of time, but I wanted to just open up the chat and the question and answers, just in case anybody may have any questions for our panelists that they can answer for you regarding this topic. So I'll just give you a few minutes, couple seconds to put your questions in. While we're waiting, I'm actually going to ask a question. And once again, anybody can answer this question. What are some strategies used to work around Andrea did sort of speak about it, but what are some strategies used to work around communication between separated parents, kin parents, and guardians? And I guess Andrea pretty much just covered it. So as she had stated, if you're having the phone conversations, that's not working, move to text, emails. And what was the name of the emails that you had mentioned, Andrea? My Family Wizard and?
Yes, so Our Family Wizard. There's also Two Homes. So those are apps that you would have to pay for. So again, if there are other avenues that you would prefer to use in terms of using a calendar, sometimes people use calendars, Google Calendar, which is completely free. That's a good way of scheduling as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another question, what are some of the strategies used to work with families when there are incidences of abuse or neglect in co-parenting relationships? And I believe, once again, somebody touched base on it. Did anybody want to answer that? Just briefly.
I think Ty had touched on it a little bit. I think there's also trying to discern, are we talking about, would child welfare become involved, right? Because and when we're looking at safety being paramount, that's going to impact how we answer that question. Could you repeat the question one more time, Anita?
Yeah, sorry. What are the strategies used to work with families when there are incidences of abuse or neglect in the co-parenting relationship?
So I think when there are instances or abuse or neglect, the assumption I'm making with the question is that those concerns have been verified, so that maybe CAS is already involved. And in those kinds of situations, I mean, CAS is going to go through their process, but for you being a family member and having to navigate issues where you are concerned about abuse or neglect, yes, you have the help of the professional, right, of the child welfare agency. And let's be fair, people don't necessarily want that help, right? So you're going to want to try to find other alternatives to be able to address some of those concerns. I mean, this panel reaching out to the Kujenga Wellness Project, that's a fantastic option, right? A community-based service. You could also, that's where you use that collaboration piece, like look at who is in your circle, who can help you and support you, who can act as that third party. Can you do, I know it's COVID, but can you do meetings in public places? Can you do exchanges in public places? Can you limit communication to text and email only, right? Because it's easy to get caught up in conflict when you're on the phone. So I think it's trying to find those other creative ways, public spaces, friends, family members, having a set schedule, right? So that exchanges are predictable, and then reaching out to community resources.
All right, perfect. Thank you. We do have a question from Eric. Eric, you can speak. I think you can talk. You can unmute yourself, Eric. I'm not sure if you're able to. Oh, hold on.
Yes, sorry. I had to unmute him, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Eric, are you there? I think he's still muted. Maybe you want to, Eric, maybe if you want to write your question in the box in the chat, and then I can ask the question for you.
Netta, as he's writing his question, I'm just thinking about the question you just asked. And I'm not sure if you specified if the abuse was within like the partners or towards the child. Because
I didn't specify, to be honest with you.
Because I wonder if the approach would be a bit different if there was concerns about abuse towards the children, right? Because there would be concern about the safety of the children. As much as CAS, they may not want to involve, it may be best to involve CAS in those incidents because, again, it's about the safety and the protection of the child, right? And you'd have to reconsider like what access might look like in that situation. Is it going to be supervised? Is it going to be monitored at some level, restricted at some level? But of course, if it's towards the individual, again, it's limiting access. But then I wonder about how that will impact the child as well, right? So if the parents are engaging in an abusive relationship and yeah, so I'm not sure what your thoughts are, everybody else, but I do wonder if it would be a different way of addressing it, if it was indeed abuse towards the partners or within the partners and then towards the child as well.
Does anybody want to also elaborate on that?
I would love to chime in. I absolutely agree. If the issue is, safety to the child or children, there may be a role for CS. There may be a role reflective of what that access looks like. And as my esteemed colleague had said earlier, when I spoke specifically about working it out amongst yourselves without that engagement, there are situations where that engagement needs to occur, right? And at that intersection, the hope would be a worker who is able to look at the bigger picture, right? Look at, the historical, the perhaps cultural impact, all these other power imbalances, all the things that you've heard throughout the night is really important to reflect upon as well. And whatever plan moving forward, involving community members, involving family members, involving the supports, the circle of supports, a wraparound with that family would also be an incredible goal. And yes, it might lead to supervised access. And I know before I left Children's Aid, there was a huge push from RED to take a look at how long we were using our supervised access program, right? That should be a shorter term intervention while parents were working on the goals, the safety goals, the reasons why we were starting to have supervised access versus it being an ongoing. But maybe in the meantime, right, while issues are worked out, while third-party family member supervisors, while these things are falling into place, that may have to be a part of the plan.
For sure, definitely agree, for sure. Unfortunately, I'm not able to. Let me just. Eric, are you there? Yeah, I think he's still not. He's not able to speak, and he didn't put the question in. So, does anybody else have any other questions that we can ask before we close for the night? Okay, so there's no other questions. I do definitely would like to thank our panelists for, oh, wait, I think there is a question. Okay, here's a question. How do you navigate co-parenting relationships where there is a disagreement between the parents with regards to issues about the child, such as a child who identifies as part of the LGBTQ community? Anybody can answer.
I've been muted myself. It's Nicole. That is an excellent question. And I know that it's been mentioned, I can't remember by which of the panelists, education, education, education. It's so important that the child is felt supported. And if we have parents that aren't able to have those open discussions and those safe discussions, then it's time to involve, third-party supports like PFLAG to be able to help that child navigate. If the child has come out, identity, all that other good stuff, but it is important for education. I would suggest that both parents need to educate themselves on how they can support this child, and that child is also going to need some supports, how they are going to be able to navigate the world.
Sure. Andrea, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just completely second that. Education is key for everyone involved. So the child, the parties, I always say parties, I don't necessarily say parents because we have all types of caregivers coming from, all different walks of life. So lots of education is needed, encouragement, support, because we have seen down the line where some of the poor reactions, how that really does impact young adults. It's quite detrimental. We see a lot of self-harming behaviors and whatnot. So yes, education is key.
Thank you.
And just to add into that, thank you, Nicole and Andrea, the other important thing to remember too is that youth who identify as being part of the LGBTQ community also are overrepresented in the foster care system. They are overrepresented when we look at youth homelessness in the GTA. So when we're looking at possible outcomes, when you have a child that's identifying as part of that community, to continue with the education piece and be aware that for many of these children and youth, their outcomes are not necessarily always positive. So when they've come out, one, that's already a strength because they have told you or a loved one or someone that that's how they identify. So we can start with that strength there, that they felt comfortable enough or to be able to share that information. So to try to build off that when you are educating yourself, when you are providing education and support to that child, because there are going to be a number of different challenges, whether it's dealing with someone's own personal feelings around that community or being the caregiver who is at odds with the other caregiver while still also supporting the child. So
Definitely.
yes, seconded, thirded, I don't know what next is. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Quadrupled, I don't know.
Are there any other questions?
Right. Am I able to just add something really quick to that?
Oh, for sure. Go on.
Just keeping in mind that the parent who is supportive may have to play an extra role for the time being, right? So being that place that the child can come to, or even supporting the child in finding a place that they can go to work through whether it's possible rejection or whether it's possible resistance on the other parent. So just ensuring that the child has someone that they can talk to navigate their feelings about their parents' lack of acceptance or lack of acknowledgement. And in the process of the education, as we've all has been said already, I think it's also important to remind the parent that your child is always your child, regardless of their sexual orientation. They're always going to be your child. So see them as your child first, and then try to make sense of the sexual orientation after. But they will always be your child, regardless of their sexual orientation. And hopefully, if they're reminded that, and with the education piece, they'll be able to work through their own hang-ups or issues about it.
For sure, definitely. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any more. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists today. I mean, the wealth of information and the note taking that I was making was amazing. I think it will definitely support families, and you touched on so many key pieces from in terms of how do you start this process, what to do when this process becomes really difficult, and I guess the basic part is how do we support our children? Because our children are living through, this experience or this breakup within the family. So absolutely. I thank you so much for that. And, I think once we start our support group that we're doing for co-parents in any setting, it would be great to have you at least come in and even speak one-on-one with our participants if you're willing to do that. So I think that would be a wealth of information for them as well. So let us know.
So I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, participants, panelists, and attendees. I hope that the attendees got a lot of information that they were able to take away tonight, and that you'll be able to utilize it within your co-parenting relationship and to help it become somewhat successful. And for sure, as has been mentioned, we had a wide variety of professionals that was able to give us information, but also provided, I don't know if we're able to put, if the panelists can able to put their contact information in the chat. So then that way, if any of the participants may want to ask questions, and teams want to ask questions, they can reach out to you. But you can also reach out to us at Kujenga Wellness Project, where we'll be able to also help you navigate the different services and the different supports that you can get. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You were amazing. The presentation was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone's got it.
Yes.
That took
That
so
was-
long.
That was so awkward.
I'm like, remove.
I was watching the rest of the panelists. I'm like, do we leave? Do we stay? No one else is leaving. So I'm just going to sit here and smile.
No, we have to debrief.
One of those awkward moments, right? We're just like, ah.
We're social workers. Yes, we need to debrief.
I know.
It's true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a good presentation. I really got a lot of, I have to admit, I got definitely a lot of information from it. And I know that with some of this information, it can help to guide me even with my work, like currently right now. Because I am noticing that we are getting a lot more custody and access cases, especially because of COVID, right? Which is exactly what, Andrea, you were stating that, since COVID, we're getting a lot of those where parents are saying, yeah, they're not letting me see my kid and, stuff like that. And it makes it sort of hard because it's that he say, she say thing. I think that's the difficult part is the he say, she say. And how do you work around that? You know what I mean? But a lot of the information I got tonight, very helpful, very helpful.
Yeah, and let us know, Andrea, because I could cut your part out, but let us know like what you want us to do or
Yeah, I just need to double check with.
yeah. Yeah, I know. But no, it was so helpful, just even the process, what that looks like and what parents can expect. So
yeah, I mean, it's a very intrusive process, as you know, right? And from my friends and family, it's like, oh my gosh, don't come here unless you have to, right?
They have no idea. Yeah.
Employ whatever strategies that you need to employ, because really and truly, once it gets to CAS and OCL, it becomes really difficult and really oppressive. We try our best, and in terms of working in these systems and not being purveyors of the oppression, if you will, but yeah, it's a delicate balancing act to be a racialized person in CAS, OCL work, working in these systems and providing these services. It's
Hugely. I've got to say, even the shift to the board of late, I've had experiences where I'm sitting and we're having consultations on students, and I ask, is this a Black student we're speaking of or a racialized student? And it's almost as if I grew a second head. And I'm thinking with all the directives, right, where we are, having to really consider our approaches when we are working with the BIPOC community, specifically focusing on ABR and AIR. Why is it a strange question for me to ask?
Right.
Why isn't it something that's straight put out on the table? And I'm just realizing that Taye is no longer here. And I commend her, right, in terms of, taking that approach and talking about her work within CES. But Andrea, like you just said, it is a heavy, heavy cross to bear. I was at CS for 15 years. My counterparts left me long before.
I'm getting out.
Right? Exactly. Right? And it in between managing, your own understanding of systems and then the top-down bureaucratic parameters that we've got to work in. So I agree, like if families are educated and can utilize support, again, and I hope I emphasize that clear enough, that if children are at risk, emotional, physical neglect, that type of harm, I'm not talking to you. But otherwise, really think before.
Yeah, I know.
No, it's true. Because I do find too that a lot of families, like parents, are calling CAS on each other, and really it is just they're in their feelings, and it's a matter of explaining to them, like, you guys are in your feelings right now, and because of that, you're impacting your kids, but it's sometimes the parents just can't get past that. So now it's about okay, now I'm really working working with the family and trying to debunk all of that stuff in order for me to get to how do I help you with the kids now, and how do I help those kids through what they're going through, right? So I'm finding that we're getting a lot of those where, you know, families are calling on each other every minute, and it's just like, guys, like, I'm sure there's other ways that you can do this without us coming as your first resort, because I know we're the first, right? They haven't challenged or gone anywhere else. They called us immediately because they want that parent to look bad, and you know what I mean? Or sometimes they're in court, so they feel like, oh, if I call a CAS and we're in court, they'll look bad, right? And they'll get that better parent look, right? So that is a really frustrating piece when we do have these kind of a situation, right?
And it's actually the opposite, right? Like the parent calling.
Right.
Sometimes, you know, you're like, okay, here we go.
Very true, very true. Yeah. But no, tonight was it was really good, and it was really needed. I hope there was quite a few families.
They're all separated families. Yeah.
But I also hope there's a lot of racialized on there, because I mean,
I believe so.
oh, that's good, because I know, like, even in some of the Facebook groups that I'm in, like I've and I made sure I posted, but I know that there was a lot of where, you know, a lot of our